And Professor Philippe Le Corre has stayed with us very kindly to look at that speech. I think those questions, the Q&A that crystallized the problems with a speech like that from President Macron, the promise not just of Europe being strategically autonomous, but to help ASEAN be that way as well. The questions raised, if Europe on its own cannot deal with Ukraine, let alone with the United States, manage what's happening, Russia doing that to Ukraine, how does it have the bandwidth to expand further deterrence, security reassurance to another region like Southeast Asia?
I think the last question about the Korean Peninsula was very revealing, and the answer, of course, was a little vague. But the fact that Europeans are being asked whether they would help in case of a nuclear or a serious military crisis in the Korean Peninsula. But that would also work for the South China Sea or perhaps a war over Taiwan, is a sign that Asians are looking at France and perhaps the EU as a possible player. But that also answers the question of Emmanuel Macron about the double standards that he's been talking about, that when he's actually asking for a little support, a little more support from Asians to address the crisis, the serious crisis over Ukraine that has been launched by Russia 3 years ago. So I think both Asians and Europeans are meant to, as the president said, to work together, perhaps to deal with international crises, multiple crises, security crises. He mentioned cybersecurity, he mentioned tariffs, he mentioned, the very unpredictable world we live in. And it also means the strategic autonomy of the EU, which Macron has been pushing for, is more relevant today than it has ever. And I think in many ways, ASEAN countries, and he mentioned Singapore a few times, the Singaporean DNA, which was also quite interesting, shows that there is some mirror between the Southeast Asian countries, which are somewhat squeezed between two great powers like the United States and China, and the Europeans as well.
This is a good point you raised. So President Macron suggesting that perhaps for once, certainly in the last few decades, there is genuine enthusiasm from Washington that there be strategic autonomy. In the past, we've seen kickback, rather resistance, for example, from Madeleine Albright, resisting any duplication, diminishing, as well as discrimination as far as Europe developing its own security as opposed to sharing that of NATO. But now, finally, you have a Trump administration that actually welcomes that. President Macron, this is his moment, is he not, to have strategic autonomy?
Well, that is because the Trump administration wants the Europeans to spend even more on defense, up to 5% of GDP in defense expenses. That's what Macron just underlined again. But at the same time, of course, NATO is still an important player in Europe rather than in Asia. In fact, I don't believe NATO will play a big role in the Indo-Pacific. But in Europe, you do need NATO as a kind of security umbrella for Eastern and Northern Europe, particularly. So both the EU and NATO has to work in parallel to ensure more security in two very important regions, such as in the Indo-Pacific and the European space. He also mentioned that the intertwined aspect of crisis and the fact Asians and Europeans have perhaps to work together to rebuild international order, a rules-based international order. This is the first time that the US is not mentioned as a pillar of the international order. You may have noticed.
Right.
But
a final
ASEAN,
question here,
with very serious
Professor Le
countries.
Corre. Pardon me, we'll pick up on this point. So the US not mentioned as a fundamental pillar of the rules-based international order. And President Macron, final question here. Is this his way of saying, let's not be passive, let's be proactive about coming up with our own strategy and hope that with strategic autonomy and with independent coalitions, we can invite superpowers to then join in, but we don't sit back and let what happens to us just happen. Final question. Is this, as the speech goes, a good strategy for Europe and Asia?
Well, I think it's very important that Europe and ASEAN come up with a different way of approaching things than a big power competition. I was referring earlier, about the statement by the U.S. Secretary of Defense. ASEAN and Asian countries do not want confrontation. They want peace. They want international order, and I think Europeans just want the same. But of course, in this world of crisis, it's very difficult, right? So on one hand, you need to enhance the security elements. And this is what France has been doing, and this is what European countries are doing increasingly. Take Poland, for example, or Germany. But ASEAN is also building itself into a power base for itself as a more autonomous region. And I think both, the EU and ASEAN go in the same direction.
All right, thanks so much for joining us this full hour, and more than that, in fact, Professor Philippe Le Corre. He's Senior Fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute Center for China Analysis, as well as Professor of Geopolitics at ESSEC Business School. Thanks so much for joining us this evening.